All right, people, it's been a while, but I'm back with a new season, and we're going to start off this season with an episode about Alfred Hitchcock. Stay tuned. So, I didn't know a whole lot about Alfred Hitchcock or his movies prior to going to university in 2012 to 2015. So, I think my mind was ripe for the picking, but I was just looking for an easy elective to take in between kind of the heavy classes that I was taking during that time. And so they used to give you a list of documents that had all of the classes listed that the English department taught for that semester. And you would go through and see the dates and times and pick whichever ones you needed to work in your schedule. But I think for me, they also had a list of like film classes and, screenwriting classes and fiction writing classes. It was so much fun to try to pick something that went into your electives. But this particular year, what stood out to me is that the film class was doing a retrospective, basically, on Alfred Hitchcock films. And it gave you a list of the movies that you would be watching during the class. And so I was like, I don't think I've ever seen Psycho or Rear Window. So I might just take the class, sit back and watch a couple of movies, get an easy A, right? I didn't really think it was going to be as interesting to me as it became, which shows that I don't know a whole lot about, picking a class or what's interesting to students. So there you go. It was an easy thing to do because one of my favorite teachers was teaching it. So it was a no-brainer. Anyway, we get into the class and he gives us a breakdown about the movies that we're going to see. And I think one of the first movies that we saw was Rear Window. And I don't think I knew at that time that one of my favorite movies, Disturbia with Shia LaBeouf, is based on Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. And so it made perfect sense why Rear Window is one of my favorite Alfred Hitchcock movies. In Disturbia, Shia LaBeouf's character is on house arrest, and there's only so far he can go from the house. And he realizes that he lives next door to a serial killer. Well, in the original Rear Window that came out in 1954, it was in color, which was great. It stars Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly. In the original movie, you have Jimmy Stewart's character, who is a photographer and apparently has hurt himself on a shoot. He's broken his leg and he's confined to a wheelchair. And that really leaves him limited mobility at the time. So all he has to do is look out the back window of his apartment that overlooks this courtyard and is kind of the window into the other 3 apartment buildings that are back there. One thing I remember thinking watching the movie was, do people not put their blinds down? They just it was like he was able to see out into everyone's apartment because nobody believed in privacy, right? And that was one of the debates that happened in class. We ask, is it okay to be a voyeur just because somebody's blinds are up and you can see in? In Disturbia, you have this idea that he's having to use binoculars to see into other people's houses, right? And what you're doing if you're using binoculars, right? And Jimmy Stewart's character too, he's kind of innocently looking, watching people working out. There's a guy in an apartment who's trying to write a musical or write some music or something like that. There's another lady who he dubs Miss Lonely Hearts because she's looking for a companion and she can't seem to find one. And it starts off innocently enough, you know. He's not really watching TV, he's using people for his entertainment. They're kind of just objects in his mind, right? But then he lands on Thorwald, who has this bedridden wife, and he's portrayed as a henpecked husband who, like, apparently sells costume jewelry, and he goes door to door selling costume jewelry, and it's all fine and dandy until Jimmy Stewart's character wakes up in the middle of the night. There's an ominous thunderstorm, and he watches Thorwald make repeated trips out of the apartment carrying his jewelry case. And it's weird, he doesn't think anything of it. It's just the thing that he's watching, like, well, that's a weird thing. He observes, and, you know, it is what it is. The next morning, he notices that out of everybody he's been watching, now the shades are drawn, right? That in and of itself should not have been shocking, but for some reason to him it was, right? And then because he's able to see into everybody else's apartment, now all of a sudden you want privacy. But he then figures out that Thorwald's wife is missing. So he becomes increasingly suspicious that he's done something to his wife. She's bedridden, so where did she go? It's interesting because his girlfriend, who's played by Grace Kelly, is like, you need to find something else to do because you have this obsession with watching other people. And I don't know that that's necessarily normal, right? He doesn't view it that way. It's not a big deal. I'm not doing anything. I'm not harming anybody, right? And Grace Kelly's character is like, you might not be harming anybody, but you're forming these weird opinions. You're being judgmental about things that you see without any real understanding of any context behind it, right? And now you're trying to convince me that this man murdered his wife when there could be an explanation for this, right? But what we know is that he did kill his wife. And so the debate in class was, does the end justify the means? Is it okay to say that you're watching people without their permission if it means that you've uncovered something that should be uncovered, you know? And so we went back and forth on that. I remember one person in class pointing out that Jimmy Stewart's character is actually a photojournalist. So he may be doing what comes naturally to him because that is in fact his job, right? But then you wonder, does that still make it okay? You're not at work. You're just observing people. And just because you stumbled onto something, that's not why you started watching them. We did settle on the fact, though, that because somebody's wife was killed, then yes, you would need to contact the police, make sure that they know all of these things, right? So yeah. And even in Disturbia that came out in 2007, you had the same question. It was fun and games until you realize that several girls and women have come up missing. And Shia LaBeouf's character realizes that he keeps seeing women go into the house that he's not sure he's seeing leave the house. So then it becomes, this person not just murdered one person, but he's a serial killer. So somebody needs to be notified about this. There's this added bonus that because he has an ankle monitor, that nothing he says is credible. The person that he's accusing is a stand-up in the community. He could never be a serial killer. So, and it's also the fact that very early on in the Disturbia movie, the neighbor realizes that the kids know that he's a serial killer, right? And so at any point, he could come into their house and do what he wants, and nobody would suspect him, or and nobody is listening to the kids. So there's also this perspective of this is how people are treated if and they make a mistake within the community. This is how kids and teenagers are treated, whether or not they're telling the truth, you know, and how oftentimes serial killers could be stand-up people in the community and they're just kind of believed no matter what. So that was an interesting turn of events. But as far as Alfred Hitchcock is concerned, you realize that Jimmy Stewart's character is in fact correct. So his girlfriend doesn't initially believe him, and I find that to be interesting. But then she does start believing him to the point where she breaks into Thorwald's apartment. She ends up finding Mrs. Thorwald's wedding ring, which really signifies to them that she didn't get up and leave. He killed her. Um, and, it's 1954, so there are no cell phones, not like what takes place in Disturbia, where they're able to call each other and keep each other abreast of what's going on or what they see or, surveilling or whatever. Um, Jimmy Stewart has to sit in the window. He can't move. He's also somewhat confined to the wheelchair to his apartment, and he can't help Grace Kelly as he's watching Thorwald come home. There's no way to signal her. There's no way to try to get her out of there. The only thing he can do is call the police and hope that they get there in enough time to save her. But anyway, Thorwald finds her in the apartment. He, attempts to strangle her. And in his defense, you've broken into his apartment. So he doesn't know why you're there, but, it is what it is. He doesn't know who you are. Um, that case could have been made, but, the police show up and Grace Kelly's character is led away. She's arrested for breaking and entering. And it is her trying to escape unharmed from this man's apartment. Anyway, it doesn't matter because Thorwald figures out that he's being surveilled by Jimmy Stewart's character. He knows the apartment that Jimmy Stewart lives in. And now that the police have left with Grace Kelly, they're not going to be on their way back or not going to be able to be reached while this man comes over to my apartment. So that was a lot of suspenseful things that happened like one after another for us in class. There was a lot of shot gas, but a lot of different things. And for that movie to have come out in 1954 and it still get that kind of reception in 2014, then he did great work. And there was great acting in it. But anyway, of course, Thorwald figures it out. He comes over to, Jimmy Stewart's apartment and threatens him, tells him to drop it, leave him alone. I know you've been watching me, you weird loser. And he tries to attack Jimmy Stewart, who uses a flashbulb to try to keep him off balance. And, the police do show up, but not until he's like pretty much thrown out the window and ends up with another broken leg. But they're able to prove that he killed his wife because, they prove it and Thorwald admits it. One would have thought that the police could have arrived a little sooner, but what do you want? Because, they arrive like just as he's being like thrown out the window. So that seems a bit much. But we did an interesting deep dive into voyeurism and the idea that people really want to look into other people's lives and watch them go about their day so that they can make judgments about, you know, being better than other people so that they don't have to actually do an examination into their own lives, into their own issues that may be plaguing them and everyone around them. It's easier to watch other people and make judgments. It's easier to watch other people and feel like, well, I'm doing better than them. Well, at least I'm not fill in the blank, you know? But the great thing is the movie made us think and the movie made us talk. So shout out to Hitchcock for that. And here it is, 2026, and I'm still talking about it. It was remade in 2007, more or less. And even now in 2026, we're having conversations about, I know everybody has a camera, but you probably shouldn't be filming people without their consent. You don't have to film everything that's going on outdoors. Um, the definition of privacy and where one could expect privacy and all of these things. So some of these things are universal, apparently. We're still having to talk about them, even though this was a 1954 film. So good times. So the next one is one of my favorites, which I didn't realize I hadn't watched at all until I got to my Alfred Hitchcock class. Psycho is considered one of Alfred Hitchcock's best films and arguably his most famous work, which I think I had only seen bits and pieces of it. Like, I think everybody has seen the parody of the shower scene in everything from The Simpsons to the Looney Tunes. So even without knowing anything about the film, you know things about the film, right? So it was good to see it in its entirety. And we got a bit of the history behind it, which also made the film stand out to me. So what I realize is that a lot of things that go on in the film as far as the plot twists are concerned are what people have been trying to mimic and get people to um, gasp about or, turn heads with. M. Night Shyamalan comes to mind, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. My professor did make a point to tell us that because the movie ended in a plot twist, when it was released to theaters, it was released with the rule that no one could be sold a ticket late. Like, you can't show up late, because it was Alfred Hitchcock's idea that if you showed up to the movie late and you missed any portion of what was going on, you wouldn't get the plot twist at the end of the movie. And so if you showed up late, you would have to come back for another showing, which probably is a good rule to have in movie theaters anyway. But that's how it was rolled out. So this movie came out in 1960. Um, it was shot in black and white on purpose. And I think that gives a more creepy feeling to the movie, because some of the things that you see Tony Perkins do as Norman Bates is even creepier because it's just black and white. But that's just my opinion. All right, let's get into it. You have Marion Crane, who's working as a real estate secretary in Phoenix, Arizona, who decides that she is going to steal $40,000 from her employer, which is odd. It's odd. Um, and I think she does it because her boyfriend, Sam, is complaining that he doesn't have the money right now for them to get married, right? Now, he doesn't ask her to steal money to pay off his debt. She just takes it upon herself to be like, this is what I'm going to do. And this is going to help me get married. But I would argue that if your man doesn't want to marry you, that's probably a good sign. But I mean, this is 1960, so there you go. But also, the extreme act of stealing from your employer really puts you at a disadvantage. But she decides to drive from Arizona to where he lives in California. And I also didn't understand, like, this is your boyfriend, fiance, but then he lives in another state. I don't know. It seemed odd. But, and it seemed to me that the relationship was set up in that this is not really going to last. And so she's doing this futile thing. She's signing herself up for jail time for a man that doesn't have the money to marry you, doesn't have the money to keep you up, all for nothing, it seems like. But anyway, she makes the trip from Arizona to where he lives in California. She even thinks about switching cars. So this is something that she's probably been planning for a while. She's like, I'm gonna switch these cars so that people can't track me down, right? Well, in this heavy rainstorm, she ends up having to stop at the Bates Motel, where the owner, Norman Bates, registers Marion, who is using an alias, so that makes sense, right? She's on the run. It all makes sense, but this motel and this guy who owns it is super creepy. And the added thing is that she's the only person there. And that would have made me not I would have kept driving because listen, I'm almost there. Whatever. I don't like motels anyway. I prefer hotels. I don't want to open the front door to where I'm sleeping and be in the outside. So that's just me. But anyway, Norman decides he wants to invite her to dinner. He's got some food that he's going to eat in the motel office. And my goodness, when you get into the motel office, everything is like full of stuff like birds, stuffed animals, and different things. And that's creepy enough. I think that it being in black and white made it worse. So that stood out to me. And that was another thing that we discussed, right, in class. Also, there's a lot of foreshadowing that happens in this particular scene because, he goes to the house that he lives in with his mother, overlooking the motel. And then you get the sense that Marion overhears him arguing with his mother about his desire to have dinner with her, right? And not the mother. He comes back and he tries to play it off that like there's nobody else there. Don't worry about that, whatever, whatever. He also tells her about his hobby of stuffing animals, being a taxidermist. And that seemed to be kind of weird to me, particularly because you have an idea of what this movie is about, and it's called Psycho. So, you can't really spell it out more than that. I'm like, he's getting ready to like kill you and stuff you. But it is foreshadowing because you figure out later what happened to his mother. So, um, he basically has this whole discussion about, his mother's illness and how she stays in that house and how people are born into some sort of trap that they would like to escape. However, Marion makes a misstep where she suggests that his mother be institutionalized and everything about him changes. He was kind of nervous, kind of shy, all of these things. But the minute that somebody suggests that he send his mother away or be away from his mother, he becomes offended and almost a different person, a different personality. He's like very quietly angry, and you get the sense that she sealed her fate. If you didn't know that when she pulled into the motel to begin with, you know it now because she's said something about his mother, right? Um, so she tries to backtrack or whatever, but it doesn't really work. You can tell that he still, whatever he thought about her is gone now, and he doesn't really like her anymore. So there's that. Um, there at one point later on, Marion is back in the motel and she decides that I'm gonna return to my job and give them back this money that I stole and try to make amends for the things that I've done in this 24-hour period, And she decides she's going to get in the shower. Well, there's the shadowy figure that comes into the bathroom. You hear the music play, and everybody knows the music, and she's stabbed to death. And I've always seen just that scene, but I think it's even worse coupled with the fact that later on, Norman comes into the room and is horrified by what he perceives to be his mother's actions while he was away, I guess. But I wonder where he would have been. There's no one else at the motel, and I don't think there's been anyone else at the motel for a while. So, where could your mother have gone and done this that you didn't know it? You know what I mean? And I think in the beginning, I had really believed that this was a mother son tag team operation, right? Because of the way Norman comes in, he cleans up the crime scene. He gets rid of the body. He gets rid of her car. It's like he's done this a few times before. And while he is horrified or unnerved, he doesn't call the police or say anything about his mother's supposed murderous rampage, right? Um, it's like, well, this happens regularly, and I get that he doesn't want to be separated from his mother. Um, One could argue several different mental illnesses and different things like that. But in the end, he doesn't seem that shocked that this has happened. He just goes on with getting rid of the body, right? Well, that's all fine until Marion's sister shows up at Sam's place and asks where Marion is. No one has heard from her. Sam doesn't even know that she's missing. Doesn't even understand why she would have been away from her job or anything like that. Um, then they bump into a private investigator who I think is Arbogast or something like that. And he's asking them questions because he's been hired by her employer to retrieve the money that she stole. Um, he figures out that she may have stopped by the Bates Motel on the way to California. How he figured that out, I'm not quite sure. I'm sure there was a way. Maybe it was explained, but I don't really know how he ended up at the Bates Motel. But he gets there and he questions Norman, and Norman is weird. He's stuttering and, not really consistent with answers. And it's interesting because Arbogast realizes that Marion has signed the guest book in the hotel from the night before. And when he asks to speak to Norman's mother, Norman refuses that. She can't really speak to people. You can't really see her, speak to her, any of that. So get out of here. And I guess he thinks that that's going to put the private investigator off. But no, he calls Lila and he fills her in on his suspicions about this motel and his intent to speak with Norman's mother. And they'll put two and two together once I figure out what information I can get from this woman, right? Well, he ends up, you know, entering the house that sits over top the motel. And as he's coming up the stairs, there is this shadowy figure that like kicks him down the stairs and slashes him about the head and as he's falling down the stairs, the person is stabbing him repeatedly. And for a 1960s movie, that really creeped me out because it had more to do with the suspense. Like, you know that you're in a slasher film. You know that at some point, you know that this person is a serial killer, so they're going to kill more than one person. Um, and you know the trigger is somebody wanting to see or speak to Norman's mother. So when these things occur, you're trying to figure out when these things are going to occur. You're holding your breath. So it's not about not knowing what's coming next. You could know what's coming next and still be like, I'm holding my breath, you know? So we did see the private investigator's death coming. It doesn't negate that it is creepy and it takes a lot out of you. But anyway, when Sam and Lila don't hear back from the private investigator, they go to the motel to look for him. So at this point, like, this is the second set of cars, belongings, and bodies that Norman has had to get rid of. So when Sam shows up and he sees somebody sitting in the window, and it's like a silhouette or whatever, he's trying to call out to him, but he gets no response. So they decide to call the local sheriff, who informs them, like, kind of matter of factly, like, I don't know who you saw in the window, but it can't be his mother. Um, his mother died in a murder suicide by strychnine poisoning, like a decade ago. There's no way you saw her sitting in the window. And he suggests that the private investigator lied to them so that he could find Marion, get the money back, and be the hero. But I guess my point is, what would be the reason to lie to them? They already know that he is a private investigator. They know that, she has stolen money, and they know that he's looking for her and to get the money back. So there's no reason, he's the authority figure. There's no reason for him to lie to them. Um, unless he thinks that they're in on it, or it was something that they were doing together as a group, or they were going to split the money or whatever. So that seemed far-fetched. But anyway, they end up back at the motel. They know something is going on. They figure that something has happened to both Marion and the private investigator Arbogast. And, they take it upon themselves to find out what Norman has in that house that he shares with his mother. So as they're working through the house, they realize that Norman is back and he is coming back into the house. So Lila, sneaks into the fruit cellar where she discovers the mummified body of what appears to be Norman's mother. And the body is like dressed and is wearing a wig. And that's unsettling in and of itself. So she starts screaming, right? Which then sends Norman in after her, but he's wearing women's clothes. He's also wearing a wig. And he attempts to attack her, and he is brought down by Sam. And so you see later on at the police station how the psychiatrist is explaining to everyone that Norman is the one who killed his mother, most likely out of jealousy, and unable to get over the fact that his mother is dead, with their weird kind of connection that they had. He stole his mother's corpse and treated it as if it was still alive. And then, he created the mother personality that takes over and feels jealousy and possession towards Norman. So anytime he has an attraction to a woman like Marion, his mother would take over. And then under that personality, he has killed a few times. So it's revealed to us that the mother personality has killed two women before Marion. And and what's really chilling is the final scene where you see Norman being held. Um, because you can hear the psychiatrist still talking about how the mom personality has completely taken over and there is no more Norman. After the psychiatrist finishes his explanation, you hear the mom's voice stating that these people are just trying to blame her. The murders were all Norman's doing, and nobody could ever blame her. She would never hurt a fly. And there is the scene where her skeleton, the human skull, is imposed over Tony Perkins' face, and that is like a chilling final scene, right? And then in the end, Marion's car and her body and her the money that she stole are pulled out of the swamp, and that's how the movie ends. And so we had a deep discussion about how this movie is based on a book. So Norman is a character that existed before this movie, but it's the weird obsession that Alfred Hitchcock has with portraying mother figures as being overbearing, right? This isn't his only film where this occurs. I'm going to talk about that later on with another movie. But the weird relationship that Norman has with his mother, and the ultimate betrayal of her having a boyfriend and killing both her and the boyfriend, and then, taking her personality and the personality being overbearing and lashing out and killing women that she saw as a threat to their relationship. And Norman must have felt some type of way because he's not allowed to have any sort of relationships outside of her. But the trigger for her death was the fact that she had replaced him with someone else. So we had a lot of those discussions, but it is still as creepy as I remember watching it. Apparently, it was a great success at the time that it was shown because it made about $800,000, which, if we adjusted for inflation, would be about $6.2 million. So that was great. But I think that for such strong subject matter for 1960, it seemed to have done really well. So there's that. And it's always a film that I keep coming back to. It's in the National Film Registry, whether you've seen it or not. Certain points of the film, the overall gist of it. You understand that it's one of the earliest examples of the slasher film genre. And there were several sequels and remakes and different things. A lot of times Tony Perkins came back as Norman Bates, but nothing could recapture the original. So I think one of the things that I remember pointing out was that the twist ending reminded me of a lot of films that I really enjoyed watching. And so it was no surprise to me that Psycho was one of the films of Alfred Hitchcock's that I really enjoy. Although I will say Rear Window is my favorite, but Psycho is a close second because of the style of storytelling. I enjoy sometimes an unreliable narrator, um, and I also enjoy the twist ending. So, with that being said, I remember, Fight Club, where Tyler Durden is revealed to be the narrator. You've got Unbreakable by M. Night Shyamalan, which reveals that Elijah is the villain the whole time. So when Bruce Willis's character survives the train crash and he's taken under Elijah's wing, you realize that all of the events that took place around the city where hundreds of people died, he was the reason for that. And of course, The Sixth Sense, where you realize that Bruce Willis was dead the whole time. It's something that Cole's character knows from the very beginning. but for some reason we don't know until the time is right. So everybody knows that movie. Another one, Gone Girl, with Ben Affleck, where his wife victimizes herself. It's just a performance. Nothing about her predicament is true. And we're led to believe in the beginning that her husband has something to hide, when really he's the real victim. Also, the movie Identity with, I believe, John Cusack and Ray Liotta. There are two parallel stories happening here, right? But then you realize one of them is subverted, and all of the people that you meet in the motel are actually Malcolm's identities. So they took the idea of a multiple personality disorder or a murderous other personality to the next level, in the same way that Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Teddy, is actually Andrew Laeddis. So we're led to believe that we're looking for a missing patient, a dangerous, a violent missing patient, and that Teddy is on the hunt for this person. But Teddy is the person that we're looking for. So the idea of subverted identity again. And lastly, the movie Frailty with Matthew McConaughey, where the narrator's identity and the moral alignment are revealed to be the opposite of what we're told in the beginning. He goes in, he's trying to draw somebody out, and he does so by telling the story where he appears as one character, but what we figure out is he's actually another. So one could say that Alfred Hitchcock is the grandfather of the original plot twist, and that these stories that are coming after him are actually paying homage to him. And that's what I choose to believe. So, on to the next one. The next one is The Birds, and it is the reason that I currently do not like birds at this juncture in my life. No matter how much people keep trying to tell me that they are great creatures and very intelligent, and I believe all of those things to be true. But I believe that at any moment, if they attacked us, we would be at their mercy, you know. So this movie came out in 1963. It's what you would call a natural horror film. So something that I didn't know was a thing, but apparently it's a subgenre of horror films where nature kind of runs amok. Usually that's in the form of some sort of animal attack or some sort of plant that poses a threat to the human characters. So you have movies like Deep Blue Sea, Arachnophobia, Eight-Legged Freaks. You have movies such as Piranha, Jaws, movies like Megalodon. You have Cocaine Bear that just kind of came out, Cujo, Lake Placid, King Cobra, Anaconda, and my personal favorite, Little Shop of Horrors. So all of those would be considered, you know, natural horror films, which I think is great. I think that's a subgenre of mine that I both enjoy and hate watching. So I found out a new thing about myself in class a couple of years ago. So shout out to me. But anyway, the movie stars Rod Taylor, Jessica Tandy, and Tippi Hedren. This is a film that opens up with Tippi Hedren's character meeting Rod Taylor's character in a pet shop where he's looking to buy a set of lovebirds for his sister Kathy's 11th birthday. Tippi Hedren plays Melanie Daniels, who is a socialite, and in her interaction with Rod's character, who's named Mitch, she's intrigued by the fact that he pretends not to know who she is. Mitch, recognizes her from a court appearance that she had to make regarding some sort of practical joke. But he pretends to mistake her for a shop employee. He spends his time peppering her with questions about birds, which she completely fails. And then he discloses that, I knew it was you all along. but he leaves without buying the birds. And there's something about his demeanor that really intrigues her. So she decides that she's going to buy these lovebirds and drive down to Bodega Bay, where he lives with his family on the weekends, on this farm that they have. Now, mind you, you met this man one time in a pet store, and now you've decided to go to this small town, in California, outside of the big city where you live, to kind of impose on his family without really thinking anything of it. This seems kind of weird stalkery behavior. And it's again another thing that we, as people who were watching it years later, were like, this is weird behavior. But she arrives in Bodega Bay and she runs into this woman named Annie Hayworth. And she discovers that Annie is a teacher at the Bodega School. She's Kathy's teacher. And Annie reveals to this strange woman who just showed up in town, that Kathy and Lydia and Mitch all live in this farm, and she gives them the address and different personal information, which seems odd to me as a New Yorker. Well, I would never do that. It's also revealed that Annie is one of Mitch's ex lovers, but their relationship ended due to his overbearing mother, Lydia, who she believes dislikes any women in Mitch's life. So here we are with another story where there is this weird obsession with keeping your son away from women. And, there's another overbearing mother. So there should be something to be said about that. But anyway, Melanie takes it upon herself to rent a boat and cross the bay to leave the lovebirds at the farm where the family lives. And he spots her as she's crossing back. Across the wharf, she's attacked by a seagull, which on some level might be a little weird, but I have been to a couple of piers, most recently when I saw Beyonce in Chicago. And so many of those people were not necessarily attacked, but the seagulls were swooping down and stealing their food. And I just remember thinking, I'm not sitting out there with my food because that's going to entice them to interact with people. Maybe the people who were on the pier didn't know that because, of course, most people who live in Chicago probably wouldn't be there. So it was probably a bunch of tourists like myself, but I knew better than to sit on the pier because I knew that that would make the birds go into a frenzy. But anyway, Mitch, he finds her, he tends to her wounds, and invites her to dinner at his farm. But when she gets there, the hens that his mother Lydia owns aren't eating. And of course, Lydia dislikes Melody due to her reputation. And it just reminds me of how celebrity gossip and fandoms have gotten out of control because they will take anything that they've read about you and choose to believe that about somebody they've never met. Now you're standing around treating a woman badly, disliking her based on something that you read in a newspaper. And instead of being nice to her and trying to get to know her and forming your own opinion, you're just being rude. So, you know, I spent the movie not particularly caring for Lydia's character. Um, but anyway, Melanie reveals that she's staying with Annie, and that was another thing that I thought was strange because here's a woman who you've never met before that you're renting out a room to. But I guess if you're renting out a room in a house that you're staying, most of the people who are staying there you don't know. But still, it seemed kind of dangerous. But they seem to form a bond over the fact that Lydia doesn't like either one of them. But Mitch invites Melanie to Kathy's birthday party that's being held the next day at the house. And later, a dead seagull is found at Annie's door. So this is foreshadowing of ominous things to come. We've already had a seagull attack Melanie on the boat, which there's no explanation really given for, and then another dead seagull found at the door. So this is kind of weird. Anyway, the next day during Kathy's party, um, Melanie starts telling Mitch about like her troubled past and how her mother ran off with another man when she was Kathy's age. And that seems to be like heavy discussion to be having at a kid's birthday party, if you ask me. I don't, you know, like we're all there to have fun. You're like a stranger that's encroaching on this birthday party, you know? So the least you could do is be a little bit jovial, but you end up telling us about all your past trauma. So I guess, whatever. Um, but it isn't long before the kids are attacked by some seagulls during a game that the kids are playing, and a lot of them are like really wounded. And I remember seeing bits and pieces of this movie as a kid. So here's another movie of his that I hadn't seen in its entirety ever. But I remember the scene at the birthday party because, like, one of the kids is like on the ground face down, and there's like a seagull on his back, like trying to peck him to death. And that has stayed with me my whole life. So when I saw it in class, I was like you can tell this is an old movie, but it's still creepy and kind of disturbing the way that the animals are doing this coordinated attack. Um, that poor kid. So like they had to like rush out, save the kids, all of these things, right? Obviously, the party is ruined and everybody ends up having to go home. And as Melanie is having dinner with Mitch and his family, there are a group of sparrows, if you can imagine, that come down through the chimney and attack inside the house. So there's this unsettling feeling that A, you don't really understand why the birds are attacking, but they do happen to attack anytime there is tension between the family, right? Anytime Melanie is invited in and she is there with Mitch and Annie and Lydia, there's an attack that happens, like a coordinated attack, but nobody can put a finger on why. And the second thing is, with the sparrow attack, there is no sort of shelter that can be had, whether you're inside or outside, which as a kid threw me off. Once the sparrows got you figure, well, I'll just stay inside. But once the sparrows got inside through the chimney and came down and into the living room, I was like, oh man, you have to move, live underground, get away some kind of way. Um, so you wonder whose side Mitch is on because Melanie makes the statement that she wants to drive back to the city and not stay in Bodega Bay anymore. And Mitch insists that she delay going back to San Francisco and just stay one more night. And she's talked into it again, a man that you met briefly at a pet store, and you're like being attacked by birds everywhere you go. This is not worth it, honey. Anyway, the next morning, Lydia gets up. She visits her neighbor to discuss the problem with the chickens because the chickens are still not eating. And when she gets up and goes over to her neighbors, she realizes that there are broken windows in his bedroom. And she's walking through his house, and the way the scene is shot, you can build anticipation. I think on some level, anybody who's watched horror films before knows that she's either going to find a dead body or they're in the process of killing him, and they could turn on her. Anything could happen. But anyway, she discovers that he's dead, and not only is he dead, but there's like an eyeless cord, like they've pecked out his eyes, and she freaks out and leaves. As I would, but I would have called somebody. Like, why didn't she call like the police or something? Like, yo, something is going on. You need to alert the people. Birds are attacking. This is crazy. You know what I mean? But she just kind of is at home resting from seeing her dead friend whose eyes have been pecked out. Lydia then points out that Kathy is out and about, and now that people are turning up dead, I fear for Kathy's safety, right? And Melanie decides, well, I'll stop by Annie's and pick her up from school. Now, here's a woman that you don't like, and now you want her picking up your daughter. But okay. Um, but this is the scene that really solidified for me how much I don't like birds. And this is the scene that did it. As Melanie is sitting outside, um, she's smoking a cigarette and she's kind of not really paying attention. So you see one crow fly overhead and you don't see it anymore, right? But the assumption is that it flew past her and is not really paying attention to her. And she's not really paying attention to it, which I find interesting, being that there have been 3 or 4 bird attacks at this point. So she's like sitting outside. It's weird. Anyway, not something I would do. So, you know, it did make us think twice about that in class. Um, but anyway, she's, listening to the kids finishing up their school lesson and all of these things. The kids are inside singing, and you keep seeing more and more birds fly up and around. At some point, she fixates on what we believe to be a crow, and she realizes that it's flying overhead, and she looks at where it lands, but on the jungle gym behind her, it's covered in crows, and they're obviously gearing up for some sort of attack. And she doesn't want to be outside, so she stands up quickly and decides to slowly make her way into the school where she warns Annie and the children. And I don't know what it was about this school building, but it's like they didn't believe in not having large windows with no coverings, floor to ceiling windows. And so they decide against keeping the children in there, because I think we know at this point it wouldn't have made a difference whether they were outside or this inside. But as a kid, I used to wonder, why did they evacuate? But anyway, they do. And the poor little kids are like sitting ducks. They get picked off. The crows are attacking, which I think is fitting, because more than one crow is a murder of crows. And they descend upon those kids um, without any mercy. And Annie and Melanie are doing what they can to keep the children safe and have them, some of them are like breaking off from the pack, which I also thought was a bad idea, but they do. And it is just a horror fest of them being, you know, wounded and traumatized by the series of birds. And you're kind of just at the birds' mercy to whenever they feel like not attacking you, right? But they break off, and I believe Kathy goes with Annie, because Melanie ends up in town at a small diner where Mitch finds her. Um, but then they're not at the diner for nothing but like a few minutes when seagulls attack a gas station attendant and cause like fire, brimstone, mayhem, an explosion, all kind of things happen, and the birds just start attacking. In the ensuing confusion, there's seagulls attacking people left and right. And I think that it's fitting to understand that prior to this last attack, that there's a woman at the diner who Melanie is explaining, like, the kids were attacked and the crows did this, and before that XYZ XYZ. And this woman is sitting there like, well, that's not possible. And don't get me started on you telling people your experience and other people thinking it's their job or their right to tell you that never really happened or it couldn't have happened that way. We won't get into that. We'll be here all day. But anyway, she starts explaining, birds don't usually work together. That's impossible. You must have done something, and birds don't usually just attack, right? And I'm almost like, yeah, that's the reason why I'm telling you this happened, because they don't usually or normally just attack for no reason. And I'm telling you that they are, you know. But of course, all of this explosion and fire happens, and everybody is caught up in the ensuing seagull attack. And then that woman is nowhere to be found. Where are you now? After you told me this doesn't really happen, you heifer. She's like number one person in that movie that I couldn't stand. Because, like, lady, I'm telling you, and now look, you could have just listened to me, right? But for some reason, Mitch runs out. He's trying to help people that are caught up in the explosion or trying to get people to safety. And Melanie runs out thinking that she's going to help people, but she ends up stuck in a phone booth. And, she's having to watch people be attacked in a phone booth. The scene is shot in the phone booth that is really great. You really get the cinematic experience that Hitchcock is trying to give you there. But on the one hand, I was wondering why she left the diner, because she didn't help anybody. And she ends up needing to be rescued by Mitch, who has to get her out of the phone booth and get her back into the diner to safety. But they end up leaving the diner together after the attack, and everybody is kind of picking up the pieces. And they go to Annie's house to pick up Kathy. And my thing was, you went to pick up Kathy. How you ended up at the diner without Kathy, I don't understand. But anyway, they go to Annie's house to pick up Kathy and find Annie's body outside. She was killed by the crows protecting Kathy. And Kathy is inside crying. She's traumatized. And they take Kathy home. They decide to barricade themselves in the family home, which apparently is still under attack by birds. I'm like, yo, why don't y'all pack your stuff and leave? Like, the guy Mitch has a place in San Francisco. Like, pack your stuff and go. Don't stay here, right? But they discover that the birds have pecked their way through the roof, and Melanie goes into the attic trying to get supplies or something she was going in there for. And I don't think she knew that the birds had made it into the house like that. But she is almost pecked to death because they descend upon her. And like Mitch again has to rescue her. And, they pull her out. But at this point, she's injured, traumatized, and catatonic. And it's at that point that everybody's like, oh, you know what? We should leave. We should take her to a hospital. We should get medical care, And so, Mitch takes his time packing up the car and getting ready for escape. And there's a sea of birds that have gathered outside on the farm, right? They're like waiting for them to come out. And I'm like, oh my goodness, how is this going to go? Well, it doesn't help that the radio is on in the background and, other, bird attacks are being reported in nearby communities and that the military may have to intervene. How they're going to intervene? No idea. What are y'all going to do? But it's on the radio. So they're trying to get to the car. Melanie is catatonic, but then she starts speaking because she doesn't want to walk out there with all kinds of birds that are just waiting for them to come out of the house to have their way with. So now everyone is on board with trying to get out of Bodega Bay. They are headed to the car. They've gotten Melanie from her catatonic state, and she is hollering about not wanting to be outside. So they're trying to get her in the car as quickly as possible, and they do. Here comes 11-year-old Kathy talking about I want my lovebirds. I have to go back and get them. Girl, what? But anyway, they let her get the lovebirds, and they're able to leave the house and drive away slowly without any of the birds attacking. My professor pointed out that it's fitting to know that the lovebirds are the only birds that don't attack. Their demeanor doesn't change. So It's also unsettling to realize that you never really get an explanation as to why the birds are the way that they are or decided to attack in the way that they've attacked. It is really, really strange. So that is the unsettling movie of mine. It still shapes the way I look at birds. I don't like it. And I remembered to say that in class and make sure that people knew it. Moving on to the next film. The next film is definitely why I am not interested in talking to people on public transit, and I have Alfred Hitchcock to thank for that. So, Strangers on a Train came out in 1951. Um, it's a movie that shows that an innocuous meeting could ruin things in your life, right? Like, imagine you're on a train sitting next to someone, and that someone is a weird stalker psychopath. And you have the basis for the movie. The story involves two strangers. One of them is a pro tennis player, and the other is, by all accounts, a psychopath who meet on a train. And I use the term meet loosely because knowing what I know now, you realize that stalker behavior and on a certain level in film and in movies and in television is kind of romanticized. But he's been following this tennis player for the longest time. So the fact that they met on the train is more on purpose than it is by accident. But the psychopath suggests that they each have a problem that the other person can help them with. And he lays out this idea that the two of them could exchange murders and both get away with it. They each have someone in their life that they want to get rid of, and the other person could do that for them, and they could avoid suspicion, is the whole plan and the basis for the movie. And that in and of itself was enough to creep me out. Could you imagine being on your way to work or on vacation, and all of a sudden you're embroiled in this murder mystery against your will? Initially, this was one of those films that was not received well. It received mixed reviews when it was released, but it has now been selected for preservation with the U.S. National Film Registry and the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And I bet so, because some of these themes run deep, even in 2026. So the film opens up with amateur tennis star Guy Haynes. He really wants to divorce his wife, Miriam, who he perceives to be promiscuous and running around with a bunch of men. And he really wants to marry Ann Morton, who is the daughter of a U.S. senator. This premise seemed interesting to me because it's 1951. I would figure that men could get divorced for any reason. But apparently that wasn't necessarily the case. While on the train, he runs into Bruno Antony, who instantly recognizes him and reveals his idea to swap murders, which I find to be weird. Like, there's no way you met me by accident and you just come up with this idea, right? But Bruno suggests that he kill Miriam, and Guy kills Bruno's father, who Bruno can't stand. And in that regard, both of them will have murdered a stranger. There will be no apparent motive. And so neither one of them will be suspected. There'll be no ties for the police to follow. And Guy is a little bit too understanding in this situation. He seems to kind of humor the guy. But I guess if somebody talks to you about what they know about your life, even though you've never met them before, that would seem strange to you. And that would also put you on edge not to do anything to rub them the wrong way, because it's telling that he knows Miriam's name because Guy has never met him before. Now that I'm older, I realize that if you would have treated Bruno with hostility, he would have just added you to the list of people he was going to kill anyway. Because it seems to me that he had a fixation with Guy in the first place. So anybody who was causing Guy trouble would have been killed. So it doesn't matter what Guy says here. He was on his way to kill Miriam. He's just letting him know beforehand. Anyway, Guy humors Bruno and he gets off like as soon as possible. But to my chagrin, he leaves behind his engraved cigarette lighter. And one of the things that stood out to me in this scene is that Bruno says something to the effect of, I don't talk much, so you can go ahead and read. I'm just going to sit here. And then proceeds to talk his ear off, sit as close as possible, and then talk about how he wants to go on this murder pact. So everything about this encounter is bad, sad for Guy. You know what I mean? Poor Guy. For his part, he can't even think about murdering his wife. He doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't even want to entertain the idea. But Bruno will not be deterred. He's clearly had these plans laid out for a long time. And he's talking about it openly on the train. Like he doesn't even care that other people can hear that they're planning on killing two people. But Guy doesn't do enough to try to deter this dude because he says something along the lines of, well, I guess your thought process has some merit. Like in theory, it would make sense that this could work out. Well, that's all you need to tell a psychopath because now you've sealed your own fate. Later on, Guy meets Miriam, who reveals that she's pregnant. The implication is that she's pregnant by someone else at her workplace. And Guy gives her the money that she demanded so that they could get a divorce and pay the divorce lawyer. But Miriam figures out she's got a good thing, probably figures out that the guy that she was having an affair with is not interested in leaving his wife to be with her. And she decides to take back that she wants a divorce. She tells him, no, I'm no longer interested in getting a divorce, and threatens to claim that he is the father of her baby if he decides to move forward with the divorce on his own. This next part plays out like a bad Matlock or a diagnosis murder episode where a guy calls up his girlfriend Ann Morton and basically vents to her that Miriam is unbearable, she's unlikable, and she's getting on his nerves, and she's just being unreasonable. And he feels like he could strangle her, right? So Hitchcock has really worked hard to show Miriam in an unsympathetic light so that the viewer doesn't feel anything when she's murdered. And that stuck out to me for the misogyny of the whole time, right? But I'll circle back to that later. Later on that evening, Miriam decides to go to an amusement park. And who do we see but Bruno at the amusement park? Because he's a stalker. This is not normal behavior. This woman doesn't even know this man. And the fact that you're keeping tabs on her and showing up where she is, that needs to be studied. But Bruno manages to get a hold of her and strangle her while Guy is on the train to Washington, D.C. When Guy arrives home, Bruno informs him, hey, Miriam is dead. I've killed her. I've done you a favor, right? And insists that Guy must honor their deal now, which at no point did Guy say he was going to be involved in any deal, that he was going to be involved in any murder. But now he's got to humor this man who's already killed his wife. Now you're starting to realize just how psychopathic this man is and how much trouble a simple conversation on the train has become for you and ultimately for your family. You may not have liked Miriam, but you weren't interested in killing her. And then now you have to prove that you had nothing to do with this, you know? So then you start thinking that Bruno's plan may not have been as foolproof as we're initially led to believe. In theory, it works out fine, but what you don't realize is that most times when spouses are killed, the surviving spouse is the main suspect. And so he didn't do anything but throw suspicion onto Guy, who hasn't actually done anything. I think at one point Guy suggests, like, I don't have to be bothered with this. I can go to the police. And Bruno is like, you can go to the police if you want to. That's only going to get you locked up. Like, nobody's going to believe that some stranger just killed her for no reason, right? They're going to believe that you and I were in cahoots together. They're going to know that this was a plan between the two of us. And that's what I'm going to say. So he traded in one lock around his neck, which was Miriam, who would not get divorced, for this psychopath who is trying to get him to do something he doesn't want to do. And I doubt that this kind of obsession that Bruno has would have ended if Guy had just given in and killed his father like he wanted, right? Like, it doesn't seem that at any point Bruno would have let go of his obsession with Guy. So now we have to figure out how to get Guy off the hook. Guy decides that he's going to go to the Morton's home, where Anne's father tells him, like, your wife has been murdered. And Anne's sister Barbara says that the police are going to think that Guy is the murderer since he's the only one that has a motive, which is something that Bruno had said just the scene before. So the police question Guy, and they can't confirm his alibi, that he was on the train to DC or coming from DC. The professor that he was talking to is so drunk that he doesn't even remember the encounter. So he can't provide an alibi for Guy. And as a result, the police kind of assign an escort to Guy that follow him around, watches every move and everything. One of the things that bothers me about this scene is Anne's sister Barbara, who is like the vehicle for all of the misogyny that is spewed forward. Like, her father has to scold her and be like, you're actually talking about a woman who was just found dead, a pregnant woman who was just found dead. And you're a woman, she's a woman, you should be a little bit sympathetic to this, right? But no, there's not a sorrowful bone in her body. She makes all kinds of judgmental calls when it comes to talking about Miriam. However, no one seems to be bothered by the fact that Anne is dating a married man. Like, his wife is the only one that seems to be subject to being called all kinds of names, even though she's the person with the husband whom your sister is seeing. But anyway, Bruno follows Guy around Washington, and he also introduces himself to Anne and appears at Senator Morton's house. And, like, I'm not sure how y'all just keep meeting strange people and inviting them back to your place. I want to have a separate discussion about that. We need to talk about safety. But it's clear that Bruno is becoming more and more out of control, and something needs to be done before more people end up dead. So during the party, Bruno decides to demonstrate how to strangle a woman. Now, the way his eyes were lighting up when talking about how you can kill somebody should have been people's first clue, but whatever. Also, I need to understand people's obsession with, like, having murder discussions at dinner parties. Like, what's that about? There's another Hitchcock movie that we watched in class that I'm not going to talk about in depth on this podcast, but it was called Rope, and that's the story is centered on the fact that they kill somebody, stuff his body in like a hollowed out table, and then have a dinner party while the dead body is in the dinner table. And, like, the discussions of, wouldn't you want to kill people? Wouldn't you want to do this if you could get away with murder? How would one get away with murder? That is both common and weird, I fear. But anyway, Bruno is at this party. He decides to demonstrate how one could strangle a woman to death, right? So he ends up getting glimpse of Barbara, who looks a lot like Miriam, and it triggers a flashback. And that poor woman that he is demonstrating on almost gets strangled to death. I know she saw her life flashing before her eyes. And people had to be like, hey, you might need to settle down. They actually had to like intervene and separate the two of them because he was getting ready to kill this woman. So, yeah. So watching the scene play out and confronts Guy, who points out like Barbara really resembles Miriam. And now this crazy dude here is strangling people. What do you know about it? And Guy has to be like, yeah, he's a nut job. He killed my wife and he's trying to get me to kill his father. I don't want to do that. And we need to devise a plan to get this dude out of my life, right? Which he should have admitted like a while ago. Seriously. Like her father is a senator. Like something could have been done, honestly. But also like before Miriam is killed, something could have been done in that you could have ended up divorced and with his daughter with his help. But I don't know. That's just me. In the meanwhile, Bruno sends Guy a package, I think, that contains a pistol and a house key and a map showing the location to his father's bedroom. And I wondered, like, did he deliver that package or were people able to send pistols through the mail? Who knows? But Guy creeps into Bruno's house. He ends up in the father's room and he's trying to warn him, like, dude, your son is trying to kill you. But instead he finds Bruno there waiting for him. So he should have known that. Like, this dude is nuts. Don't trust anything that he says. But Guy is trying to save somebody else's life, in the way that he couldn't save Miriam's. And he is constantly being punished for it. He is trying to persuade Bruno to get psychiatric help, seek somebody, but Bruno is not trying to hear that. And he threatens Guy for breaking their deal. And I'm like, dude, there is no deal. I'm trying not to be involved in this. Do you not see this? But I will say there was some heated debate as to whether or not Bruno's father actually exists. Like in class, we were like, Alfred Hitchcock can't be trusted. A lot of what you see on screen, you're trying to determine, is this relevant? Is this not relevant? Is this all a lie? Because of course we had already watched Psycho. So there was some debate as to whether or not Bruno's father was real or not real. And there was actually a scene with his mother that was kind of disturbing where the two of them are like, you know, you need psychiatric help. No, you need psychiatric help. It's clear that they both do, right? And how both of them do not like the father, but the father is nowhere to be found. And so you're wondering, like, did they already kill him or what? So many questions. Anne even takes it upon herself to visit the Bruno home and talk to his mother and try to be like, hey, your son is on like a murderous rampage and you need to watch out. But his mother is also nuts, so she's not paying attention. But Bruno manages to mention to Anne that he's got Guy's lighter. And when she mentions that to Guy, they figure out that Bruno intends to plant it at the scene of the murder and incriminate him because now he feels let down by Guy. Like, you did not follow through on the deal. I have no use for you. I'm going to ruin your life, right? But Guy takes it upon himself to be like, okay, what we're going to do is shake the police escort and go to the amusement park to stop Bruno, right? So Bruno arrives at the amusement park and one of the carnival workers actually recognizes him from the night of the murder and he informs the police. However, the police think they're there to arrest Guy, who they've been looking for. They think they have the evidence now. They've got somebody to identify Guy, and they get there and realize that Guy and Bruno have gotten into a fight on a carousel. And they believe that Guy is trying to escape custody. So the police start shooting in an amusement park full of people and kids that may be on a carousel, but whatever. the police officers end up killing the carousel operator, and now the carousel is spinning out of control. Because this movie is shot in black and white, this scene is kind of harrowing, right? It's up there with the original scene where Miriam gets killed because you're actually watching her be strangled through her glasses that have fallen to the ground, right? But this scene is a bit even more harrowing because there's a lot of chaos going on and the carousel is spinning out of control and they're on it trying to survive, but um, a lot more people could be injured or killed because of this nonsense that Bruno keeps up. Imagine my shock that there is another carnival worker who has to crawl underneath the carousel as it's spinning wildly like a top and apply the brakes. But of course, applying the brakes at the last second um, causes the carousel to break and kind of spin off its support. And it basically violently traps Bruno, who's mortally injured underneath, right? So the worker finally gets a chance to tell police that it's Bruno who he saw and not Guy that was at the amusement park that night, the night of the murder. And they're able to unclench Bruno's hand and realize that Guy's lighter is in his hand and that he was there to plant this at the scene of the crime. So for them, that ties up all loose ends. Like they take Guy back down to the station and basically say, you know, fill in these gaps for us. And he basically tells them, listen, this weird dude um, followed me onto the train. He told me this thing, and then proceeded to murder my wife and ruin my life. And so for them, that ties up all loose ends. And I thought that for 1950, for a police investigation, all right, that seems okay. But I think the kicker is later, when Guy is on the train, another guy tries to strike up conversation with him just the same way that Bruno did. And he grabs Anne's hand and they abruptly get away because they know that last time they ended up in a murder investigation. So they do not want to talk to anybody on the train. And I love that for them. It's also why I try not to talk to strangers when I'm traveling publicly because people are weird. And I think that's an understatement, in this regard, in this movie. In class, I think we talked about the randomness of this movie, right? It seemingly begins with a chance encounter, although the more that you investigate it, it's not really by chance. It is by chance that someone could read something about you or see something about you and become obsessed. So in that regard, that is kind of creepy. But it is the suggestion that something could happen in your mundane life and deeply derail everything that you have going on at that time. It is Guy's bad luck to be the hyper fixation of somebody who's deeply ill and deeply obsessed and homicidal. Poor Miriam didn't even know the man. And, her and her baby were killed off pretty quickly. There is a chaos in everyday life that occurs that just gives this film an unsettling nature. It's also the idea that somebody could do something to someone close to you and you be accused of that at any point. At any moment, you could be thrust knee deep into a murder plot or be accused of being part of a murder plot. And no matter what you say, people may or may not believe you. So that was also creepy. So we got a kick out of talking about that in class. But in the end, those were my 4 favorite movies from my Alfred Hitchcock class. Like I said, we did also watch Rope, which if you get a chance to watch that, it's a great movie. It takes place all in one room, and the film opens with the murder, which is kind of surprising for us. It's shot in color, so y'all will like that. It's another film that Jimmy Stewart is in. And then we also watched, I believe, Vertigo. So If you get a chance to watch that, definitely do. But those were the four that I enjoyed the most. If you have any Alfred Hitchcock films that you enjoy, please let me know. But until next time, peeps.